One of the most useful features of IDEs are multicursors. Have you ever been in a situation where you're looking over your coworkers' shoulders and they're pumping code faster out than you can think? A lot of it comes down to being comfortable with your IDE. So let's have a look today at multicursors in Visual Studio Code and how they work. For this I have created a small example. So we see here we do have a main function and a vector, and for this vector we want to push back 5 different values into it. If you now want to adapt a few of these values, you can do the following thing. So you can click behind a certain value and then use the Alt key and click behind the next value, and then you get a second cursor at the next position. So I can now basically add 2 values at the same time. This is very useful if you want to change values that are not the same but are at the same position. So for instance, in a table, or as here in a different struct where you push back values or where you want to emplace back, it's basically when it's at the same position. I can achieve the same thing by pressing Ctrl, Shift and up or down key to also create the cursor right below my current position or right above my current position. But Visual Studio is much smarter than that. So usually you want to find certain instances of something and replace it. For instance, if I now say I want to replace the pushback, I can easily do that by pressing Ctrl D. Ctrl D will select the complete instance of something. So for instance here, Visual Studio Code realizes that there is a dot, and after this dot there's the bracket, so it will select the complete pushback. I can now repeatedly press Ctrl D to select the next instance that fits what I have already selected. So I can push Ctrl D, Ctrl D, Ctrl D, Ctrl D, and then I have all of the 5 different pushbacks selected, and I can, for instance, replace them by an emplace back. The same also works, for instance, for my vector. So I can also use Ctrl D here, and then I can cycle through all of the different instances of what I have currently selected. I can also do that, for instance, for something that is more smaller, so it doesn't need to be a complete instance. So I can also select the small TOR and also use Ctrl D to select the next TOR instance, the next TOR, and for instance delete that. If I'm pretty sure that I want to replace all of them, I can also use Ctrl Shift L and select all of the instances at once and replace them by, for instance, my new name for this particular vector. You can also undo your selection. So for instance, if I select now these 3 values and I see that I didn't really want to select the 3rd one, instead of starting all over, I can use Ctrl U to remove the last cursor that I have been added. I can also use now Alt to click and add a new cursor, and then use Ctrl U to also remove the new cursor. This is really handy if you're working with big selections and a single mistake doesn't mean you need to start all over. Multicursors also work great for copy pasting. So I can put a cursor before the 7, put a cursor before the 1, and then use Shift to select both of these values and copy it. And for instance, I can now put a cursor here and there and paste the values that I have just copied. So it's really great if you want to move big values around that are at similar positions. As with most of these productivity hacks, it comes down to practice. So in the beginning, you need to force yourself to really use the hotkeys, go a little bit slower, that in the long run, you can nail it down. So if you enjoyed the content and learned something today, please hit like, and as always, get your machine up and running and try it out and enjoy coding.